Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the 17th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who's the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. These will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them to the panel to consider in a logical order. We urge you to ask questions, please, right from the start, and I will try to put as many as possible to the panel. Can I reiterate, though, please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. So I hope you enjoy the discussion, and I'll see you later. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and greetings from Washington, D.C., the home of the Free Speech Project and Georgetown University. We have a wonderful panel today. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Penelope Muse Abernathy is visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. She has done some of the pioneering work in the United States on the issue of news deserts, places that have almost no access to news of their own local communities, let alone the rest of the world. And Penny is joining us today from rural North Carolina. Aled Eirig is a journalist and former head of news and current affairs for BBC Wales. He ran the largest BBC newsroom outside of London for many years and has remained very involved. He's on the, he has served on the content board of Ofcom, which I believe is the regulator of media in the United Kingdom. He's speaking with us today from Cardiff, in Wales. Susan Elkington has 30 years of experience in the international media sector, including at the BBC and other places as well, BBC Worldwide, Polygram, Filmed Entertainment. And she is very involved with new media services and digital platforms. She's with us today from London. And we were to be joined by Jim Brady, Vice President for Journalism Programs at the Knight Foundation, who had an emergency develop and is unable to be with us today. And very kindly, Steve Waldman, a remarkable person who is the president and co-founder of Report for America. Steve, by the way, wrote a report for America some years ago on the information needs of the American public. And he now is engaged much of his time in the recruitment of aspiring young journalists to go to work in newsrooms around the vast United States that in many cases haven't had new staff in quite a long time, trying to revive local media. So we have many perspectives and a lot to accomplish. I want to begin just very briefly asking our panelists for a definition of what each of them thinks that would qualify independent news media. What is it we're trying to preserve and cause to survive at this moment in time? Sue?
Thank you, Sandy. I think from my point of view, particularly with a sort of a European background, I look at it as really a key piece of the public broadcasting structure within Europe, but not only. I mean, there is a lot of private money and public money in significant news outlets. So I don't look at it from a finance point of view, it has to be a public service as such. I look at it really from the structure of how they respect regulation, how they respect plurality of views and expression, rather than purely from the actual structure of how they're set up originally. So I think in Europe we have a good mix of that, and we can talk a little bit about those various examples.
Steve Waldman, what do you consider to be independent news media?
Well, first, that they exist.
I neglected to say that you're speaking to us from Brooklyn, by the way. Sorry.
The first criteria is that they actually exist. I think probably 10 years ago, my answer would have focused a little bit more on, is it a news organization that has the freedom to report on what they want to report on and is not buffeted around by government or an ownership structure that, distorts the proper search for the truth. And those are still obviously, the key factors, but at least on the local level these days in the United States, there's a bigger problem, which is that there is no media to even ask that question about, that you have thousands of communities that don't have news organizations at all. So there's obviously not an independent press there. So we have a dual problem of the kind of core, the floor falling out from news organizations in general. And then on top of that, I would say the traditional issues of how do you make it so that both the ownership and the spirit and the financing allows for real independent thought.
Thanks, Aled. What would you say to that?
I'd say, first of all, what comes to my mind is that you have to separate out different parts of media between broadcast newspapers and online. I come from a regulatory background, as it were, so I think that's pretty fundamental in terms of ensuring a level of independence for broadcasters. But I think the two big issues that I think Steve has sort of touched on are firstly freedom from commercial pressure, and secondly freedom from political interference, and how you gauge that and how you secure that sort of works very differently across the world in various countries. But those will be the main facets, and I think it's I think independence is very important. I also think that people tend to use the word independent when perhaps it's not quite what they mean, because even what we'd call independent journalism can be fashioned very much by the nature of the funding of the organization you're dealing with, or the nature of the beast that you're looking at or listening to.
Penny.
Well, my perspective is kind of an amalgam of the experiences I had before I became a professor and looked at local news, where for the previous 15 years at both the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review, I was dealing with international markets. And there I defined an independent medium as being an organization that could print the facts without fear of being shut down because for libel, for censorship, or whatever. I think in the US, we tended to use independent in kind of a technical term because we've had so much consolidation of especially newspapers and television stations. We say, is it not part of a large chain? Is it a small chain? Is it not? I tend to use an example that's much more, and a definition much more like what Steve mentioned. I tend to say, is this a news organization where either the publisher or the owner and the editor have both the latitude and or freedom and the resources to respond to the local needs and expectations of that community? That means journalistically as well as in a commercial sense, because until recently, everything in the US has been very commercial in contrast to Europe and other democracies.
Thanks very much. I think we should move as quickly as we can to the crisis besetting the BBC at the moment, which I think so many people regard as the flagship for the world of independent broadcasting, or we've all believed it to be independent. I hope not wrongly so. And Alan, I wonder how you would describe what's happened to the BBC. I think that the issue of the license fee is something that many of our listeners and participants today don't know about.
Yeah, well, crisis was crisis. Every so often, pressure is brought to the BBC to review the way it's funded, which is very fundamental to the way it works and the way it can commission material, and it can remain independent of government and any other pressures, including commercial pressures. There are two elements, I think, to this. The government is wishing the BBC to seriously review the way it's funded, and at the moment it's funded through the license fee, which is about £157, about $200, I think, plus for each household for the BBC license, which gives you the right to see anything on BBC, television, radio, online, whatever. Politically, the government is doing that partly because it's very, very fed up with the BBC and considers it to be anti-conservative and anti-government. But I think there's another element as well, in that there are fewer people paying for the license fee, and younger people in particular, under the age of 30, are hardly watching BBC in the conventional linear manner. It's very much doing it in their own time, either through YouTube or through other methods of transmission. So it's very, very difficult to persuade young people in particular that the BBC is for them, and that they should be paying £157 a year for that privilege. So I think there's a real political issue, but there's also a very practical issue in terms of how people are thinking of the BBC. And the BBC is appealing very much to an older audience, plus 55, 60s, which in itself is dangerous. So the present license fee settlement comes to an end in 2027. The government refused to increase the level of license fee. So consistently over the last 10 years, the value of the license fee has declined. And as you know, the cost of broadcasting, broadcast inflation is much higher than inflation generally. So the BBC's income at the moment is about £32 billion. It sounds a lot, but when you compare it to some of the streamers like Netflix and Amazon and so forth, it sort of pales into insignificance. And I think the BBC is faced with that sort of dilemma of how, on the one hand, to maintain a universal service, universally popular, and at the same time ensure a constant sort of stream of income, and that is a dilemma.
So you had many years with the BBC as well, and do you have you heard of suggestions of how to solve this problem, apart from a political solution which might allow the continuation of the license fee and an increase in the license fee? Are there some other ideas of how the BBC might be funded and assured its independence in the future?
Well, the funding model traditionally with content is subscription, ad supported, or some other public source of funding. So in those buckets, the one that more frequently comes to the surface is subscription. And the government can look at the UK and seen a very successful rise of Sky Television, which includes Sky News, now owned by Comcast, and look at a subscription model and say those who want to pay for it, those who want it should pay for it. And that's a very attractive commercial argument in the midst of this debate. It's not a new debate, exactly as Aled said. It's not a new, it might feel like a crisis at the moment because they're having another focused attention at it. But it's certainly not a new thing. It's really a perennial question as to how the BBC gets funded. So we are somewhat a little bit used to it, but we are in an environment whereby bits of the BBC have been chipped away at for some time in terms of how pensioners pay for the license fee. They now have to pay for it, how bits of the Foreign Service gets paid, or the Foreign Office withdrew its funding and the BBC pays that. So they've chipped away at the BBC model and are now really coming at it a little bit more wholesale in terms of that funding model, which comes up in 27. So it is more likely that a model which involves some form of subscription is probably one that the government would look at more than the ad market, because they see that those who want it should pay for it and it suits those sort of commercial. But we have a couple of years of debate to get on this, and it's not the first time that it's come up. But if you look at public services across Europe, there's a blended model with most of those whereby there's either a license fee and some advertising. So another alternative would be a reduced license fee and some fund and some airtime to be sold. So there's a couple of options, and I don't think the government's settled. What I do think is it's a really interesting point at this time in history, really to be looking at what the BBC has done in terms of news gathering, particularly around Ukraine. And I do wonder whether, and Aled, I don't know whether you think that whether the government might just think again at this time, and indeed any of the European public broadcasters, because of the role that the BBC plays in getting its international services out and its 40 odd language services out, whether you might think quite carefully in Europe as to how you adjust funding, and whether you start trying to impair services through reduced funding means at such an important time in our history, where there really is I would say quite a serious battle of values, especially at a time where getting news services distributed is probably at the best it's ever been. If you look at the broadband infrastructure that exists globally in the world, now is the time to keep news services up and buoyant and strong and plural. And so I do wonder whether from February the 24th, whether the government might think slightly differently about how you fund the BBC and impair its news, which is one of its 3 principles. Whether you would think differently about what you might do with the BBC versus 6 months ago. Aled, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think it shifted the ground of the debate, which goes to show how shaky the original ground was, if you like.
Yes, I agree.
The problem with having a more commercial model, such as subscription for the BBC, is that you'll see quite quickly, I think, a diminution in the range of programming and the level of universality with which the BBC is producing programming for its audience. And also, I think, from an UK national interest point of view, the key thing about the BBC is that it's such a talisman in terms of sort of journalistic standards, and also putting forward an UK view in a way that is seen as being duly impartial by other people across the world. And you would be a better judge of this than I am. But I think I worked with the British Council in terms of looking at soft power in relation to the UK, and I think the BBC is absolutely one of the key elements in that. And I think when you put it in the scales of trying to decide what the role of the BBC is in the context of war, for example. You know, there's only one real answer to the question for the BBC, which is to keep it going as long as you can as an universal model. Now, there may be clever ways of funding that. You know, that's the challenge over the next couple of years, but I don't think subscription or a more commercial model would hack it, really. I don't think that would work.
No,
I'd like to-
yeah, I agree with you. I just think those are the options I think that the government frequently will go through, that subscription or ad model, because those tend to be the models that are available.
Sure. Sue, thanks. I just want to turn to the parallel situation in the United States about publicly funded broadcasting, which is more limited part of the spectrum in the US than in the UK. And Penny and Steve, I wonder whether you predict from your own particular perspectives another crisis for public broadcasting in the United States. When I say another, there have been many over the years. I myself was affected by one at National Public Radio quite a long time ago, when we still called it National Public Radio rather than just NPR. It was useful to conceal the word public in its name after a certain time, which says something in itself. But for PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, NPR, which have been accused for many years of being quote unquote liberal, and therefore for some people a problem. Do you think we're facing another round sort of parallel to what Boris Johnson is doing in the UK to the BBC? Penny?
Let me start, and I think Steve will have some input too, based on what he's been working on with the Local Journalism Sustainability Act here in the US. Yes, you know, it's almost every 4 years. Whenever you come up for funding for public broadcasting, you have the same issue. I think there are two things that are very different from the UK and from many Western style democracies, and that is the very small percentage we pay directly to public broadcasting. That doesn't mean they're not public subsidies for commercial entities, news entities, whether it's television, whether it's newspapers or the like. But, you know, we pay just a fraction of what is paid in UK or in France or Germany. And public broadcasting in Europe often extends down to the regional level. It's only at the very top level. The only way it extends down at the regional level here is through NPR. Interestingly, most of the local news that we see is almost entirely, I would say somewhere around 98 to 99% on NPR, not on PBS. There are only about 13 stations out of the several hundred that are PBS stations here in the US that even have a local program. So, you know, while there's a lot of huffing and puffing at the national level about how bad public broadcasting is, or how, you know, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting needs to be cut back, what we're really talking about with a cutback in funding for PBS would be entertainment shows. What the real hammer hits on the local side down at NPR. And of course, in many ways, it's not as bad a hammer for NPR, because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, almost 90% of the funds now for NPR come from donations from people actually supporting them. So Steve,
from non-governmental sources.
Right, exactly. So Steve, why don't you take it from there?
Well, when we put together a coalition about 1.5 years ago called the Rebuild Local News Coalition to look at public policy as it related to local news. And we decided to kind of go in a very different direction and in a way redefine what public media means by saying it's not, having it go through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting through a public media system is not the only way for the public to support media. And so we we're not opposed to that, obviously, we support that too, but we felt that when it comes to direct support to local journalism, that we should look at some other approaches as well. And so what we all kind of rallied around was an approach embodied in a bill called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which had three main provisions. One was a payroll tax credit to hire and retain local journalists. Another was a tax credit for consumers to buy subscriptions in a local news or paper or donate to a local nonprofit, including public radio. And third was a tax credit for small businesses to advertise or underwrite in local media. So it is government money going to the news, and in many cases may end up going to public radio or public TV stations, but through a very different mechanism than has been traditional. And we did this for two practical reasons. One is we thought we would get a lot more money this way, that if we had gone through an annual appropriations process through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, we probably wouldn't get anything. But if we did, maybe we could get a $25 million add-on or something like that. By contrast, the payroll tax credit, just that one part of it, which is actually put in the Build Back Better bill that passed the House of Representatives, was scored at $1.7 billion over 5 years, because it's an entitlement and it's baked into the tax code instead of through the appropriations process. So that was one reason. And the other reason was that politically, in this environment, we felt like there was a much stronger case to say, like, we're trying to get more money and support, we're trying to empower consumers and businesses to support local news. And we're fine with the decision-making about where that money goes being partly in the hands of consumers and businesses as opposed to government officials, though we have some of that as well. So it's a little bit of a different approach that I think is not instead of the traditional public broadcasting approach, but hopefully very complementary.
And how do you rate the prospects for getting that through Congress as it's constituted right now?
Well, the payroll tax credit part was amazingly passed by the House of Representatives and came within, 2 votes of passing in the Senate. It was part of the Build Back Better Act that died at the last minute in the Senate for lack of votes from Manchin and Senator Sinema. We think, and it has very strong support. So we think that it still has a chance if there is a new thing, if there's a new Build Back, like smaller version of Build Back Better or some reconciliation-based budget, bill that happens in the next few months. I think we've got a shot at that being there. And it's a, it would be the largest infusion of government money into a local news system in the US in, at least 100 years.
That would be
May I ask
impressive.
a question.
Alan?
Forgive my ignorance about the US system, but to what extent is local cable TV of any importance in terms of local journalism?
It's a great question. There's about 10 to 15 really good, I think that's right, Penny may know, about really good local cable TV news operations. But and they're quite good and they're in some important cities, but that's basically it. Outside of, and it's only really one cable. There was a while where it looked like all the cable companies were going to be getting into that, and they were all starting little local news things, and they mostly have abandoned those. And there's only one company at this point, Charter Spectrum, that is doing it, and they're quite good. And it's not totally clear to me why they have concluded that it's smart business and all the other ones have concluded that it's not. I hope they're right. I think they're right.
Let me add one thing. One thing to think about, and I come up against this all the time. And the only countries that seem to understand this are Canada, Australia, maybe Brazil. We've got a massive geographic problem here in terms of infrastructure for cable and for digital. So, while the broadband part of the infrastructure bill that did pass is going to be hugely important, and may provide an opening, as Steve says, to more cable providing this. But I live in rural North Carolina. We have Spectrum in the small town down the road, 8 miles from me. I can't get that. I'm relegated to satellite TV, and there is no local news on satellite TV. In fact, I get the South Carolina stations. So that means I can't even turn to TV to find out what's going on in the state legislature in North Carolina.
So that gets to the issue of news deserts and the extent to which they are a problem, not only in the less populated parts of the United States, but the UK and other countries as well, Western democratic countries and other places. And it's pretty simplistic to say that the success of democratic government depends on the people getting information and giving in some fashion or another their consent to what's being done on their behalf. A very fundamental part of Western democracy. Are news deserts an issue in the United Kingdom as they are in the US? And we'll ask Penny perhaps to describe the degree of them here. Sue or Alan, would you like to take that?
I mean, I don't think so, in the sense that, I mean, far be it for me to talk again on behalf of the EU, but the EU had a very specific piece of legislation which really required telecom companies, particularly the parastatal telecom companies like France Telecom, KPN, BT, to build out broadband in rural areas. And indeed, cable companies do, when they come to invest in Europe, have a requirement to build out. Now, what that does is it provides a broadband infrastructure in rural communities, which benefit from that in many ways, including just sheer employment and the ability to develop businesses, but it also benefits the access to news. And I think it is rare in the UK that if you haven't got a decent broadband infrastructure, then there's one planned in the next 18 months or 2 years. And that's true of rural France as well. So that's been a long-term goal within the EU. And I think that is still, I think it's quite rare. Aled, I would say that in the UK, that this would be pretty rare to get some form of delivery of news.
Well, I think you're right about broadband, but I think there's been a sharp decline in the number of newspapers titles available, and even when you've still got titles, they've thinned out, reduced the number of journalists. They've gone more towards clickbait and using online material and providing a much sort of poorer editorial mix. And one of the reasons I'm very aware of this is in Wales, we have a population of 3 million. We've had devolution with our own parliament for the last 20 years. In that period, we've had receding number of newspapers. We don't have one national newspaper for Wales. We have 2 regional ones. So there's a terrible lack of information and communication through that media. And what's interesting is with the growth of broadband, the BBC have gone into locally produced news websites. And because the BBC has been so embarrassed by doing this at the same time as the newspapers are in decline, they've actually come to a deal with the newspaper industry to employ journalists jointly across the UK. So the journalists do work for the BBC, but they also work for the local newspaper. But I think that goes to show how badly newspapers are doing and how they're tailing off and losing their impact, I think.
Yeah, that's true. You will never get a Guardian in my mother's village, which is just outside.
Penny, has the news desert problem gotten worse in this country I think not so long ago, we were shocked to think of cities, major American cities that had news deserts within them, where there was not much information about local neighborhoods or municipal government and the like.
I'd say it's been a downward trend for the last 15 to 20 years here in the US. It seems to have started somewhere around 2005, 2006. It was really exacerbated by the 2008 recession. And in a matter of what's really truly astounding, in the matter of a few months, it cost it initially in 2008, 13 times annual trailing earnings to buy a newspaper. By the end of 2008, you could buy a newspaper for 3 times annual earnings. So if you think about it, that really encouraged a kind of influx of people who thought newspapers were on the going the way of the dinosaur. Steve's 2011 report really captured the essence of what newspapers have meant to this vast geographic country of ours. It has been, in many cases, the prime, if not the sole source of local news and information, whether you're talking about inner city neighborhoods, whether you're talking about suburbs, or whether you're talking about the rural areas that are often referred to as flyover country in the US. So when you start losing newspapers, and we've lost more than 1/4 of all local newspapers, and most of those have been in small and mid-sized communities. My definition of a news desert has evolved over time. And I think it's important to think about that in terms of where we stand and what we need to do to address it. So my definition today is not just, is this an area without a newspaper, but it is an area or a community where residents have very limited access. And I want to come back and talk about access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that not only feeds our democracy at the local level, but also builds community. And I think that is a real problem that we've had in a digital age. We still elect representatives on a geographic basis. So if there's no sense of geographic community, no sense of belonging to a specific place and time, that allows polarization to come into the politics at both the national level all the way down to the very local level, where we have cultural wars and fed by misinformation.
Yeah.
Steve?
Sandy, can I just jump in there? I find that really interesting. And you began to answer my question, which is, what do you think the societal impact is on those communities over a period of time of living and getting used to and growing up in a news desert? I mean, do youngsters just not get the appetite for reading and accessing news and therefore grow up without it and don't expect to have it? Do they understand the loss? Do they understand the fact?
Let's ask Steve. Let's ask Steve to answer that question.
Well, let me just sort of lay the groundwork by adding one other additional element to what Penny said about what's happening out there. So in addition to the really pioneering work that Penny did on news deserts, she also coined a second phrase, which is ghost newspapers. And those are newspapers that exist. They're publishing. You can go get them. There's words on paper. And yet they have been so gutted that they basically don't cover the community. There was another study that's looked at 200 newspapers and found that 17% of the articles in the local newspaper were local, 17%. And so part of what's happening is in those papers and just in general is that the vacuum created by the retrenchment of local news is being filled. And it tends to be filled by national news, which is more polarizing. So we'll come back to the polarization issue. Or it's filled by social media, which tends to be more inaccurate and have more misinformation. So you have, in some ways, in a lot of these communities, you've gone from having good information to no information to bad information. That's been sort of the trajectory in too many communities. Now, in addition to the problems that Susan mentioned, there's so much academic research now that the consequences of the decline of local news are profound, and on everything from there's a long history of evidence that it leads to lower voter turnout, but it goes way beyond that. You have fewer candidates running for office. You have members of Congress less likely to advocate for their constituents. You have people not knowing anything about who they're voting for. You have people doing fewer Google searches about the mayor. And then on top of that, those basic civic functions, there's evidence now that it leads to lower bond ratings, worse financing, higher taxes, more corporate crime, more pollution. So all of the watchdog functions that we as journalists kind of always figured, were important, and we intuitively thought were good for the community, where now the wonderful new generation of academics has actually started to quantify this and show that when you lose local reporting, that there's very profound and increasingly measurable negative impacts on the health of community. I would summarize it as a community's ability to solve its own problems disappears or gets much, much harder. And the one other statistic I want to throw out there is because it's sometimes hard to, when you're talking about news outlets, it gets a bit muddy. Like, it's sometimes hard to know whether going from 2 to 1 is important, or there's one there, but it's a ghost newspaper. How do you know? The other thing I would look at is in the course of just 15 years, we've seen a drop in newspaper employment of 57%. And if you look at it in terms of, and that's at a time when population is growing and when the amount of government spending on the state and local level is going. If you look at it in terms of number of reporters per dollar spent by the government in state and local levels, the drop is 67% drop in reporters in 15 years. Like, that's an incredibly dramatic drop in a short amount of time. And I think that's as good a measure as anything of just the what's happening to reporting, and where that shortage is distributed is one of the things that's so interesting about Penny's work on news deserts is they appear all over the country. You can see them in the middle of cities. You can see them in rural counties. You can see them in suburbs. Like, actually, a lot of them are in suburbs because you had newspapers that had covered outlying areas, and as the finances collapsed, they contracted, and they kind of, with their limited resources, covered the center city and left the ring communities not covered. So anyway, it's happening everywhere.
We're going to go in just a few minutes to Mike to handle the Q&A, but I want to make sure that we ask our participants to offer more cues to get A's in that part of the program. So there's still a chance to send your questions to the Q&A link. This notion of the impact on democracy is so profound that it makes me want to raise one other point. There's several areas we could still go into, actually 2 I'll raise quickly. One is how this is affecting the peace and stability in the world at large as an international problem. I mean, you could argue that Russia right now is one vast news desert because Vladimir Putin has pretty much 98% or more locked up control over public discussion of important issues in Russia. And this has a profound impact on, many of us think, well, how could the Russian people possibly support this war? Well, if they have no other source of information about what's happening in Ukraine, they probably might support that war. I mean, I think we know very little about this. So just some observations I think might be useful. And then the other thing I want to talk about leading into Mike handling the questions is, what's been the impact of digitization of the news on all these phenomena, just briefly. But does anyone have any thoughts about the world? There are many developing countries that are news deserts. That's for certain. And it's been true for a long time. Is that getting worse as well? Penny, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know what's interesting? We held a global summit with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation back in October and November. And what we concluded is that, you know, there are issues that we're seeing in the US that are manifest themselves in Western democracies. But then what was very interesting was the feedback I got from literally around the world in places we would call democracies, such as Brazil, such as places where people actually elect representatives, still theoretically elect representatives, talking about the immense pressure that's put on censorship on many of the leading news organizations there. It can be direct, it can be subtle. And I mean, Russia is the classic example. If you use the wrong phrase, you go to prison. But I mean, at the Wall Street Journal, we dealt with that all the time. You could print what was true and still have your reporter put in jail. So, I mean, it is a good analogy internationally, I think, to think about where are there real news deserts, not for the commercial reasons that we see in the US, where we've largely relied on a commercial model to fund local news for 250 years, but think about it more in terms of what happens with state-owned media, or what happens when the state controls what can be said, and you don't have a system in which you can escape jail by printing the truth. You can either be sent there for libel when you printed the truth, or you can be censored and shut down and not distributed for all of that. So the Wall Street Journal, every time in June when they mentioned Tiananmen Square, the Wall Street Journal was censored in China. You know, it was a statement by the Wall Street Journal, though, to commemorate Tiananmen Square. But if you were in China and subscribing, I think we had, I can't remember how many, I think it was 25,000 circulation in China itself. You didn't see anything about Tiananmen Square on that particular day that we printed and acknowledged Tiananmen Square.
Are there any other places in Europe that where Sue, you pointed out that the EU has tried to distribute information more effectively around Europe? Are there places where you think there are news deserts in Europe?
I think the EU set out to build out broadband infrastructure because that brought sort of equality of access to opportunity, and that is an EU objective. But through infrastructure, you know, the broadband is incredibly important to the development of communities, and so that's been a focus of the EU, and they have maintained that. So if you're Telecom Italia and you haven't built out in rural Italy, you get fined. So and those, so I think that's been a long-term goal of the EU for a number of reasons, but that helps distribute news, quite frankly.
Well, that gets to the other question I had: is the digitization of news on balance? It appeared certainly initially it was going to democratize the news and information system around the world. On the other hand, it has made available and given equal status to a lot of, shall we say, unreliable information. So on balance, Steve, in this country and in the United States and other places you're aware of, has digitizing news been a good development?
Well, the internet, the arrival of the internet that is part of the digitization of the news is part of what killed the local news business model. So in that sense, that part of it hasn't been good. But I do think, but for that, the digitization has allowed for a much broader range of different players, including people that had not traditionally been, included in the mainstream media ecosystems. So it's a very mixed bag. I think digitization, or just the digital access, digital world, is so easy to, as you said, like it's we are now focused on the horrible aspects of how easy it is to create websites or news streams. But the flip side is also true, that it's also been a way for new entrants into the news business, far more creativity than we had before.
Relatively low cost, yes. Yeah.
I'm sure
But
that's
I
right.
think just to go back to the point I made at the beginning, it's about the nature of regulation of the different media. And I was certainly one of the people who were so keen to see the democratization of news, as it were, through this wonderful new technology. But I think what we've also found is that important players, state or commercial, can be very, very good in terms of the way they play the technology in order to sell their message. And we've seen that, develop to such a sophisticated level that people like Cambridge Analytica and so forth have been able to analyze quite carefully how the medium is being used. So I think that's a fundamental sort of question mark set against your question, really.
Right.
Yeah.
Mike, I think we're ready to hear about some of the questions coming in and see what direction that takes us.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for an interesting debate so far. Angela Preston, who's a regular with us. Good to hear from you again, Angela. After the Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty of sex trafficking in the US, most news outlets covered the outcome. On the other hand, the BBC interviewed Anne Dershowitz, accused of being a John in the trafficking ring, who criticised the victim. The BBC has apologised, however. Trust becomes an issue since the BBC is in Prince Andrew's background. Do people expect more neutrality from independent news services? Yes, Alan, go on, you laugh first. So.
Well, one, what is neutral? And it's a big question about independence. I think the BBC has got a big blind spot on the royal family. And I think it's tied up with the BBC's role as part of the story of the UK. And I think the BBC finds it very, very difficult to criticise some of its icons. Having said that, of course, it was perfectly ready to do that with the royal family in the Diana interview, which we now know was a bit problematic, to say the least, done by Martin Bashir. So I take the point, and I think I often felt, certainly working in the BBC was a bit more nervous than should be about dealing with those sort of issues, and I think that was wrong.
Having said that, I mean, Emily Maitlis did interview
oh, absolutely,
Prince Andrew, which was probably one of the sort of leading.
Well, I think the funny thing about the BBC is that one bit the BBC are very happy to slag off another bit of the BBC.
Yeah.
Do you want to say some more about that Prince Andrew interview, Sue?
Yes. I suppose I was just offering it as, I mean, I think you're right, Alan. I think the BBC has a traditionally always used to try to round up the news with a pet story or a nice story about the royal family that was, you know, to make you feel happy at the end of your news broadcast, and doesn't do that anymore. But I think the BBC has a difficult relationship, but I don't actually think they have under-reported on Prince Andrew. And I think the Emily Maitlis interview which was she's for those of you who don't know, she's a leading broadcaster, news broadcaster, and she did an astounding interview, and really, I think this was prior to the actual court case of, I think it was prior to Epstein at that point. So it was quite early on in the story, and I don't think they've held back from but I think it is awkward for them. But my sense is that they are quite quick to give you headline news, but maybe less opinion on it. So if you're following,
I think one other problem with the BBC is that in relation to the royal family is that often they will wait for the newspaper tabloids to run with a story before they cover it. And I think it's a reflection of the BBC's nervousness And I mean, to some extent, some covered this really. They don't want to be seen to be taking the lead in doing a story that sort of paints the royal family negatively.
Mm. Angela has another question. She says, private hedge funds buy and gut newsrooms, reported by NPR, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic. Should laws limit this practice since it slants news by limiting news organizations? Penny, do you want to take that?
Yeah, and I'd also, Steve has been working on this too, so I think it would be an interesting, his perspective might be slightly different from mine. I actually started looking at news deserts because someone asked me to look at what had happened to the ownership of news organizations. That was in 2012. As I spent the next 2 years looking, I was stunned at how there had been a turnover, total turnover, at least in newspapers, of who owned newspapers. So prior to 2008, you had longstanding family headed news organizations and chains. And a large chain in the US was Gannett, and it had somewhere around 100 newspapers. What happened in the years intervening after 2008 is you had a group of hedge funds, private equity groups, and just investment entities whose only measure of success was shareholder return, jump into the news organization. And as a result, today, our largest chain, which is Gannett, I call it the new Gannett because it's a combination of a merger of Gannett and Gatehouse, they have more than 600 papers. So not only have they employed a notion of going in, remember I said you could buy a newspaper even today for only about 3 times earnings. So think about it. If you are in a kind of buy them, strip them, and flip them, you can get something to profitability that wasn't profitable in 3 years. And then you can decide whether to harvest it or sell it to someone else or simply close it down as write it off as a lost cause. So when you had to buy something at 13 times earnings, you had to make a commitment to the community. And I would also say when you only own 40 newspapers or you only own 20 in a chain and it was headed by the names of the either the flagship newspaper like the New York Times regional group, or it was headed by Hearst, or it was headed by Knight Ridder, which were or even Gannett, which was the founder of that chain. There was some kind of notion of a dual mission, both to journalism and serving the civic mission of journalism, as well as the commercial one for shareholders. So I do think that we've seen a gutting of newspapers by investment entities. I call them broadly because that encompasses hedge funds as well as private equity groups and other types of pension funds that have bought newspapers. But I also think there is a real problem with kind of figuring out how you deal with it, because the standard we use to determine whether somebody dominates in a market does not apply to what has really happened with hedge funds and private equity groups. Steve, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, another statistic that I got from Penny was that half of the daily newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by or highly influenced by hedge funds or private equity funds, if I'm getting that right. So that's an enormous factor that it seems to be in some ways one of the most under-discussed aspects of the current local news crisis. Now, they didn't, in most cases, cause this crisis. You know, the consolidation and the decline started before private equity and hedge funds got interested in this. But it does seem to be the case that the mergers and the acquisitions of more and more newspapers by private equity and hedge funds has exacerbated the problem and made it harder to solve. And that's because some of the factors that Penny talked about, which is that their mindset and approach to why they're making these decisions. I get this question all the time of like, if newspapers are a dying industry, why are they buying them? You know, why do they think it's a good business? And it's a great question, because normally we think of investment as, you know, buy low, sell high. You buy something at a lower value, you increase the value, you sell it for more. that's not what they're doing in a lot of these cases. They're looking at it as a cash flow business. And the sad reality is, if you buy a newspaper and gut the staff, you get an immediate savings. But it doesn't actually play out in a commensurate drop in circulation right away. So you can go for several years having an immediate cost savings without devastating your circulation or your revenue, or not, accelerating it that much. And so that's, you do the arbitrage on those two things, and there's real cash there. And that is actually the business model on a lot of these acquisitions. And that's why they don't particularly care one way or another whether they're building up value in the news organization. So on the public policy question, we just last week submitted a paper to the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, making the case that the current antitrust enforcement tools are not serving the news landscape well. Partially it's because of what Penny said. If you look at this through traditional antitrust measures of, the number of outlets, well, in a lot of cases, before the hedge fund bought the newspaper, there was one newspaper, and after they bought it, there was one newspaper. So by traditional measures, there was no drop in the amount of competition. However, you are having a drop in the amount of local reporting, and you are having all sorts of measurable harms. So we're saying that a revised antitrust approach should look at whether or not a community is being harmed by being turned into a news desert or being turned into an area devoid of much local reporting, and that would be a legitimate factor for antitrust regulators to consider when they're assessing mergers.
Any other comments on that? That's pretty comprehensive. Can we get back to this thorny question about Russia and Ukraine? Is the reporting of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine being independently reported in the West? And how do we know? There was a conversation that we were having recently with somebody in Moscow. Absolutely, this lady, absolutely, totally convinced that they were being told the truth about Ukraine. No question about it, How do we say that the reporting of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is being independently reported in the West? You want to try that, Alan?
Well, one of the most remarkable things, I think, is the fact that the BBC correspondent is still in Moscow. Steve Rosenthal, who's fantastic, I think, and I think that's incredibly valuable in terms of getting another perspective on Ukraine. I'm sometimes worried about the fact that the story we're getting from Ukraine is from one particular prism, and I'm sure that is the nature of conflict. And I've got no basis at all for saying that it's misleading in any way. But I'm just aware that that there's a lack of other perspectives. And I think the very fact that Rosenthal is doing what he's doing, I think is, first of all, remarkable. He's still being allowed to broadcast, given the circumstances. And also the job he's doing. And that gives me, I think, greater security in terms of knowing that what I'm being told is objective and impartial, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also a very unusual experience as a war, in that the citizens are reporting their own news.
Yeah.
And much of that information is being geolocated and verified by third parties, such as Bellingcat, for example. So you know, and then you will have a military analyst matching shell types beside a block of flats and verifying it. So I think it's unusual for us really as sort of citizens of the world to be experiencing a war that is being reported in the way it is. It's being reported by its own citizens, protagonists, and then also backed up by, you know, organizations such as Bellingcat, who have really tracked and are looking at what I would say real factual data in terms of geolocation and matching. So it's a really unusual experience in terms of news sources, which are usually sort of validating each other. So I don't get the sense that what's coming out of the mainstream European broadcasters who are covering it, that they're reporting it incorrectly. I think there's a very unusual sort of factor in it, in that the Ukrainian leaders themselves tend to be skewed young. They're all speaking English, so they're very good at telling their story. So that might be something that we're experiencing in a slightly different way, where we're not getting that out of the Russians, if you like, but certainly the Ukrainians are, the Ukrainian citizens who are going through this incredible sort of suffering are reporting themselves just through social media, as well as, you know, what's coming out of Poland and the countries around that are supporting them. So it's very unusual in terms of news, and I don't think there's an angle on from the Western news. I don't get that sense.
Are you aware of other European broadcasters broadcasting from Russia?
No, I'm sure Euronews is, which is a European backed.
Yeah.
I wonder what Penny and Steve would say to that question on the coverage that most Americans are seeing and reading and hearing.
Well, it seems like, I don't know what, it's a good question of what actually are most Americans seeing and reading and hearing. I don't know the answer to that in terms of the coverage of Ukraine. It did seem like, you know, on CNN and maybe the other cable, I don't know, that there was a bit of groupthink in the beginning that, you know, Ukraine was going to be trounced in a matter of days. And now there's sort of maybe groupthink in the other direction of Ukraine's winning, and I'm slightly suspicious of both, but it's noticeable how if you go online and read, you know, the various Twitter feeds from very sophisticated people in the defense and foreign policy establishment, you are getting a completely different perspective on the war than if you're watching TV. And it's so much on there that never seems to quite make it on cable. Now, that may be because it's not verified. And this is a really interesting question that I don't know the answer to. It's like this whole phenomenon of CNN or others saying such and such just happened, but we haven't verified it yet. Or there's a piece of video that has come through that we have verified. And this whole, I just don't know enough about what's going into those decisions to know whether they're being overly selective, underly selective. I'm not sure.
Or too many sources.
Could just be that. It's just a deluge.
Penny?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to pick up on two things that Sue mentioned. One, I think that for me, this is an example of where being in a connected world with the internet allows us to get multiple sources and from people on the ground, and it kind of feeds that freedom, that free flow of information. And you know, we do have as Steve said, the either the verified or not verified. We haven't been able to do that, so we get a much broader perspective. To me, this really is the living room war. The question I have, and I think it may be almost too early to see it. in terms of, dealing with millennials and Gen Zers, I wonder if they see it in the same way people in our generation do. And I wonder where they're getting their information from that, because cable news outlets tend to skew much older. They tend to skew into our generation. Where are they getting the information on Ukraine? And do they see the living room more in the same way we do? And back to what Steve was mentioning before, I mean, where are the other sources and where are they getting that? And I don't see it as much of a seminal event for the younger generations as I see it for people in our generation.
Very interesting. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to have to bring it to a close in a moment, but Sandy, is there anything you want to say in closing?
Well, aside from thanking everybody, Mike, I do want to point out that our next program in May is going to be about this very subject, about the Ukraine-Russian war and how credible things are. I myself, I can look out the window of my apartment and see the Russian embassy in Washington. And one of the things that has struck me, I walk around it all the time. One thing that struck me is how little focus there's been on the Russian embassy as a place of protest during this war. Almost nothing happening. Nothing. The reason you haven't seen on television protests at the Russian embassy in Washington over the invasion of Ukraine is there've hardly been any. And that is an interesting point in and of itself. Anyway, this has been a wonderful conversation that Mike and I have been wanting to get to some time. Leaves me worried about the independent media, but reassured that all of the people we're talking to here are thinking and promoting and trying to do something about it. And I think we can all appreciate that. Thanks to the support we have at Georgetown University, John McCabe, our project manager and editor, and to the president of the university, Jack DeGioia, Tom Banchoff, the international vice president, for the support they've given to this series. For now, we thought it would just run the pandemic. Well, it's still running the pandemic, and going for 1.5 years now that we've been doing it. Learned a great deal. So thanks to everyone for tuning in today too. Please take a chance to look at Free Speech Project, all one word, .georgetown.edu. You'll see that we've been documenting threats to free speech and expression in the United States for several years now, and the results are quite startling. Back to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Sandy, and thanks for your contribution. Thanks also to Aled Eyrig, Susan Elkington, Penny Abernethy, Steve Alderman, and our best wishes to Jim Brady, who is unavailable because of family sickness, and we hope things aren't too bad there. So thank him also, because he was involved in the run-up to this. It's been an interesting debate, a very serious debate, I think, and it's been a stimulating discussion. The actual meeting that we have, or event that we have on Ukraine, will be on Monday the 16th of May, and I can assure you that that our panel will be as distinguished as it has been today. And so I do hope you will join us for that 16th of May, same time. Another event that you might like to note is actually tomorrow, which is the 26th of April at 11 a.m. Again, a joint event with Georgetown and with the Oxford colleges. That's 11 a.m. or 4 p.m. in British summertime, when Dr. Rachel Creswell will be talking about St. Anselm, going back to medievalism. But I've heard this this scholar talk, and it's really excellent. What she finds in commonality between the medieval and the modern. My thanks as well to those at Georgetown, but also to those in Oxford, John O'Connor, the regent of Blackfriars Hall, Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, and at Campion Hall, Nick Austin, the master of the hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, Campion Hall administrators. My thanks too to John McCabe. It's a terrific link between us. if you asked a question today, I think we got through most of the questions, but if you have asked a question today which hasn't been answered, we'll endeavour to get an answer to you in due course. And thank all of you who did ask questions. Thanks for your attendance today and for all your support for the various series that both Sandy and I organise. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until next time, take care, everybody. Keep safe. Goodbye. And thanks again to the panelists and to you, Sandy.